evening, everyone. Investigators have now made an arrest in the 1993 murder of 17-year-old Mandy Steingasser.
It was new forensic evidence that got investigators what they needed. 25 years ago, the body of the Lewiston teen was found in a nearby park a month after she was last seen leaving a party. 7 Eyewitness News reporter Ed Riley has more now on the murder and a promise to the victim's father.
In 2017, a detective in Western New York made a phone call to a forensic lab that would change nothing immediately and everything eventually. He wasn't reporting a new crime. He wasn't calling about an active case. He was asking about evidence that had been sitting, untouched, in a cardboard box for almost a quarter of a century. Specifically, he wanted to know if anyone had ever tried to extract DNA from 2 strands of hair that had been collected in 1993. The answer was no. Nobody had. The hair was still there. The evidence envelope is still sealed. The fibers are still in their original packaging, exactly as they'd been logged 24 years earlier, when a teenager had gotten into a car one night and never gotten out again. Back then, those hairs had been examined under a microscope. A lab technician in 1993 could see them, could photograph them, could document that they came from a struggle, both with roots still attached, both separated by force, rather than shed naturally. What that technician could not do, what no lab in 1993 could do, was read the genetic information locked inside those roots. Science just didn't exist yet. By 2017, it did. The detective wasn't the first person to suggest this. Investigators in that Western New York town had been asking the same question, quietly, for years. Every few years, one of them would wonder out loud if the technology had finally moved forward. Every few years, the answer came back the same way. Not yet, not quite, not far enough. You needed more material than 2 hair roots could give you. You needed older tests that required larger samples. The science of the early 2000s simply wasn't sensitive enough. It was wasteful to send it in and risk destroying the evidence for nothing. Then, somewhere between 2015 and 2017, something shifted. The testing methods got better. The extraction processes got more delicate. Labs learned how to pull a full genetic profile out of material that previous technology would have called too small, too old, too fragile. The sensitivity threshold finally dropped below what those 2 hair roots could provide, which meant, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, an old piece of evidence wasn't useless anymore. It was just waiting to be read. The detective made the call. The hair went out to the lab. And for the first time since 1993, someone was about to learn what it had been trying to say all along. But before that lab report arrived, before that phone call changed anything, before DNA finally broke open a case that suspicion had already solved, we have to go back. We have to understand what happened to Mandy Steingasser on a single night in September, and why a whole town spent 25 years knowing the answer while the law sat completely helpless. If you're new here and you want stories about cases that changed because of what we learned, subscribe. Cases like this one remind us why that science, that patience, and that refusal to let a file die matter as much as they do. Let's go back to 1993. Mandy Steingasser was 17 years old. On September 18, 1993. She was an only child in a working-class neighborhood in North Tonawanda, New York, a city 20 miles north of Buffalo that spent most of its energy trying to convince itself it was safer than its bigger, louder neighbor. By most measures, it was. Low crime. Neighborhood bars where people knew your name. The kind of town where parents felt comfortable letting teenagers walk to corner stores alone, where backyard barbecues happened without guards at the gate. It was the kind of place where nothing like what was about to happen was supposed to occur. Before that night, before the facts of the case, before anything became evidence, Mandy was just a kid with a specific way of moving through the world. She loved animals in a way that made her different from other kids her age. Not in an abstract way, in a direct, fearless way. She would pick up snakes other teenagers would run from. She'd hold spiders in her palm without flinching. She was the girl who noticed when something small was hurt and did something about it. It mattered, because later, when people tried to understand who she was, that detail would tell them something about her. She wasn't easily frightened. She didn't run from things without understanding them first. In her bedroom, she had blasted Led Zeppelin loud enough for neighbors to hear the drums through the walls. The walls themselves were covered in posters, band names and faces stacked over one another, the way a 17-year-old girl marks her own interior territory. She was close to her father in a way that mattered, the kind of closeness that meant camping trips together, fishing trips, long drives with no real destination, just moving and talking and being comfortable in the silence between words. Richard and Lorraine Steingasser weren't the kind of parents who built their authority on curfews and threats. They built something different instead. They built a system, a promise. If Mandy was running late, she called. If she got home safe, she woke them up to say so. No questions, no lectures, no investigation into whether she'd been where she said she was. Just a simple covenant. They wanted to know she was alive. Everything else was secondary to that. And if she ever, for any reason, ended up somewhere she shouldn't be, a party that turned ugly, a friend's house where something went wrong, a situation that suddenly felt dangerous, they told her to call, no questions, and they would come get her. It was a promise built for exactly one purpose, so their daughter could never truly disappear. That promise would matter more than anyone understood at the time. September 18 came on a Saturday. Mandy's friends had a plan. Get into a bar in Buffalo, see a live band, be home by midnight. Simple enough. The kind of night that happened in teenage circles constantly. The small transgression of fake IDs or slipping in through a side door. The minor rebellion that felt adult and wasn't. She didn't go alone. 3 of them went together. There was Stacy, her close friend. There was Brian, Stacy's boyfriend. And there was Wayne, Brian's friend, who had his own apartment and could legally buy alcohol without arousing suspicion. They picked up whiskey and rum before they'd even left North Tonawanda. Not to arrive at a bar already drunk, but close enough that they'd stay that way. The bottles came out before the night even started. They drank while driving. They drank at different stops. The plan to be home by midnight already seemed less like a commitment and more like something to not think too hard about. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the moment was about to come that would decide everything about what happened next. They were walking toward another party when a car full of strangers pulled up beside them on an empty street. The men jumped out yelling, accusing Brian and Wayne of harassing someone in the neighborhood. It wasn't true, but that didn't matter. Not then. Not anymore. The fight that erupted on that empty street corner came fast and without warning. 1 second they were walking. The next second, men were yelling accusations about harassment, and fists were moving. Shouting filled the empty space between buildings. Mandy and Stacy froze for just a moment, processing what was happening, and then something inside both of them made the same calculation at the same time. Run. Stacy ran one direction. Mandy ran another, both trying to get away from the noise and the bodies and the sudden violence that had come out of nowhere. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, sirens started to wail. Here's where the choice that decided everything happened. A patrol car meant safety in theory. It meant an officer would stop the fight, separate the chaos, restore order. It also meant something else to a 17-year-old girl who'd been drinking all night. It meant police lights. It meant an officer asking questions. It meant her parents finding out that she'd been drinking underage, that she'd been in a place where violence happened, that she'd broken the careful trust they'd built. And that mattered more to Mandy in that moment than the danger she was walking into alone. So she made a choice. Instead of running toward the sirens, toward safety that came with a cost she wasn't willing to pay, she turned away from the flashing lights and started walking north, up Oliver Street, toward home, choosing the empty dark over getting caught. All she knew was that home was over a mile away, and she had legs, and she could make it before her parents ever woke up. The street was quiet now, no more shouting, no more sirens close enough to matter, just her footsteps against the pavement, and the cold creeping into her arms. She passed dark storefronts and parked cars, moving steadily, rehearsing in her head how she'd slip inside the house without waking anyone. The night was hers to navigate alone, and she didn't yet know that someone was already watching. Up ahead, near a corner store, a car slowed down. Two women were on that street at 1 o'clock in the morning, separated by distance, but connected by what they were about to witness. One of them stood outside a corner store at a payphone, waiting for someone or something. The other watched from an apartment window just above the sidewalk, looking out at an ordinary street that was about to become the last place anyone saw Mandy Steingasser alive. Both of them watched the car as it rolled past Mandy once, its headlights sweeping across the empty pavement. Both watched as it did something a stranger's car shouldn't do. It turned around. The car swung through a U-turn and pulled up right beside her, easing to a stop just a few feet from where she walked. No screeching tires. No sudden movement. Just a deliberate, calculated approach. Mandy didn't run. The woman at the payphone kept watching. The woman in the window kept watching. Both saw the same thing. A car door opens. Mandy leans down toward the passenger window and says something to whoever is inside. Just a few seconds of conversation, maybe less. No yelling, no struggle, no sign of fear. Just a girl talking to a driver, and then, with that same calmness, climbing into the passenger seat without a second thought. He isn't scared. She isn't afraid. The only reason a 17-year-old girl gets into a car alone at 1 o'clock in the morning is because the person behind the wheel isn't a stranger at all. She recognizes the driver. She knows him. The car pulled away from that corner. And here's the detail that would matter decades later. The detail that nobody understood the weight of in that moment. The woman in the apartment window kept staring out at that empty street for several more minutes afterward. She had nothing better to do at 1 o'clock in the morning. She was just watching an ordinary street, waiting for nothing in particular. In all that time, the car never came back, not once. If the driver had really done what he would later claim, if his story held even the smallest piece of truth about what happened next, his headlights should have swept right back under her window. They never did. At 2:30 in the morning, the phone rang at the Steingasser house. It was one of Mandy's friends, asking if she'd made it home. Lorraine Steingasser didn't need to check her daughter's bed to know the answer. Mandy always woke her parents up the second she walked through the door, every single time, no matter how late. It was the promise. It was how they all lived. The silence in the house told Lorraine everything she needed to know. She and Richard sat up for the rest of that night, listening for footsteps on the stairs, for the sound of the front door opening, for headlights sweeping across the driveway. Morning came instead of Mandy. No phone call, no explanation. Just a daughter who had broken the covenant for the first time, and parents who already understood what that meant. They started calling everyone, every friend they could think of. Nobody had seen her since the fight broke out hours earlier. One of Mandy's friends had a father who was a police officer. He came to the house himself to take the initial report. The help didn't matter yet. By the time police got involved, they already had a simple answer ready. She probably ran away. Maybe there was a boyfriend out of state. Maybe she'd decided to follow him. That happens, they said. Young girls do that. Mandy's parents knew better. A girl who calls home from the middle of a street fight does not suddenly decide to vanish on purpose a few hours later. Richard and Lorraine said it again and again to anyone who would listen, but local police wouldn't budge on the theory. When they refused to prioritize the case, her parents pushed further, calling in the FBI themselves, refusing to let their daughter disappear into a closed file that nobody was working. 5 weeks passed, with no sign of her. 5 weeks of flyers stapled to telephone poles all over North Tonawanda. 5 weeks of search parties combing through fields and ditches in the autumn cold. 5 weeks of word spreading through a town that thought nothing like this could happen here, and learning slowly that it already had. Parents who used to let their kids walk to the corner store alone started driving them instead. Doors that stayed unlocked got locked. A working-class city that prided itself on being safer than Buffalo was learning what it felt like when that safety was an illusion. For 5 weeks, Mandy's bedroom stayed exactly the way she'd left it. The Led Zeppelin posters on the walls, the clothes on the floor, the space of a girl who was coming back, because nobody could bring themselves to touch it and make her absence permanent. Then, on October 25th, the waiting ended. 2 men walked into a county park outside town that day hunting for wild mushrooms near a small lake. They followed a trail along the water, just looking for what the season might offer. Something off the path stopped them cold, a sight that simply didn't belong in a quiet county park. They looked down into a ravine just off the walking trail, and one of them already knew, before he said a word, what they were about to find. 5 weeks of searching, and she'd been lying there the entire time, hidden just off a trail that people walked past every week, close enough to the water that whoever left her there meant for the lake to take her eventually. But bodies don't always cooperate with intent. She caught in the bushes on the way down, and stayed there through all 5 weeks of searching, waiting to be found. She had been strangled. Her own clothing had been used against her, leaving no doubt about intent. There was a severe fracture to her skull from a heavy blow. Her hands bore clear evidence of the fight she'd put up before it ended. She had not been sexually assaulted. Whatever happened in that park happened fast, violent, and driven by something personal. The kind of violence that comes from someone who knew her, not a stranger passing through. The kind of violence that comes from control and intent and rage directed at a specific person. Lorraine Steingasser had known since 2:30 that first morning that her daughter hadn't run away from anything. Now, on October 25th, standing in a place she never wanted to be, she knew for certain someone had taken her, hurt her, and left her in the woods like she didn't matter at all. But he was wrong about that last part. She mattered. She would matter. And in ways he couldn't have predicted, she was about to matter more. Joseph Bellstat was 18 years old, in September of 1993. He wasn't remarkable in any obvious way. He was a classmate from the same high school Mandy walked through every day, someone who existed in that social margin between known and unknown. The kind of person you might recognize but never quite talk to. He lived with his grandmother, and he was driving her car that night, a vehicle that wasn't his, borrowed for reasons that seemed ordinary at the time. Hours after Mandy goes missing, before police have said his name out loud, before anyone has officially accused him of anything at all, Bellstat shows up at a friend's house looking for Wayne. Wayne is the friend he barely knows. They aren't close. But Bellstat finds him on the porch and starts talking, before Wayne asks him a single question. He tells Wayne that Mandy is missing. Then, completely unprompted, he begins explaining where he dropped her off. Which street, which church, who she supposedly walked away with. He hands Wayne his entire alibi, before Wayne even knew he needed one. Sit with that for a second. An 18-year-old providing a detailed accounting of his movements to someone who barely knows him, to someone who hasn't accused him of anything, in a moment when nobody has even said his name yet. Innocent people wait to be asked. They don't anticipate questions that haven't come. They don't prepare explanations for situations that haven't been presented as problems. What Bellstat was doing was getting ahead of a story before it got away from him. 3 days later, he finally walks into the police station himself. He repeats almost the same story to detectives. He picked her up, she changed her mind a few minutes in, He dropped her near a party at a church a few blocks away, and the last he saw of her, she was walking toward a stranger sitting on the steps. Nobody, not then, not ever, finds that stranger. Nobody can confirm a single piece of it. From there, the story falls apart fast. He tells police he spent that night across the border in Canada with friends. It's a lie, and not a complicated one. Detectives ask one of those supposed friends to wear a wire and sit down with Bellstat, just to see what he'll say when he thinks he's talking to someone on his side. Within days, the whole construction cracks. There was no trip, no Canada, nothing but an 18-year-old scrambling to cover a few missing hours that suddenly mattered more than anything else in his life. Twice, he sits down for a polygraph examination. The first time, he gets up and walks out before it's finished. The second time, he stays through the entire test and fails on the two questions that matter most. Was he involved in Mandy's disappearance? Was he hiding something? He fails both. The lies keep coming. When her body is found, he's asked if he knows the park where she was discovered. Bellstat says he's never set foot there in his life. Not once. That's false. A young woman comes forward and tells detectives he took her to that exact spot weeks before Mandy was killed. That quiet lover's lane with its ravine, and its water, and its isolation. He'd taken someone else there before. He knew it. Every time investigators check his story against actual facts, it breaks a little more. Every time they ask him a direct question, they get an answer that contradicts what they can verify. Not vague answers, not confused recollections. Direct lies, each one calculated. Each one failing because investigators kept asking follow-up questions. What Bellstat was showing investigators was something important. Guilty behavior. A pattern of it. The kind of behavior that makes detectives certain they're looking at the right person. But certainty isn't proof. And that's a difference that would matter for the next 25 years. A little before sunrise, less than an hour after the last time anyone saw Mandy alive, two people spot Joseph Bellstat at a 24-hour car wash. He isn't just rinsing off mud or running the car through a standard wash cycle. He's scrubbing every inch of that grandmother's vehicle alone, under fluorescent lights, at an hour when the streets are empty. The seats, the floor mats, every panel, inside and out. No music. No friends keeping him company during this time. Just a teenager scouring a car like his life depends on it, in full view of anyone who might drive past. In a town this small, somebody always sees something. Somebody saw this. Police searched that grandmother's car anyway, top to bottom, vacuuming out every seam of the upholstery, bagging anything that might mean something later, anything that might be evidence, even if they couldn't use it yet. And what they find should have ended this case right there in 1993. 2 strands of hair in the back seat, a few fibers from the carpet, the same fibers later found stuck to Mandy's clothing. Both hairs still had their roots attached. Both had been separated by force rather than shed naturally. That detail meant something specific. Struggle. No ambiguity. No question of whether she'd simply sat in that car during normal circumstances. The roots didn't lie. They meant violence. Investigators know exactly what it could mean. They just can't prove it. The science of 1993 can look at a hair under a microscope and say it's consistent with a person. Look at the color. Look at the diameter. Look at the medullary pattern. A trained technician can say, yes, this hair is consistent with someone of this general description. But that's all they can say. Consistent isn't proof. Consistency isn't specificity. Thousands of people could be consistent with the same hair sample. What 1993's science cannot do is read the genetic information locked inside that hair root, cannot extract DNA, cannot pull a full genetic profile that would say, beyond any doubt, this hair belongs to this person and no one else. The technology doesn't exist yet. The extraction methods are too crude. They require too much material. These two tiny hair roots simply don't have enough genetic material to yield anything useful by the standards of that time. So the proof sits inside an evidence envelope, inside a cardboard box at police headquarters, completely infuriatingly useless, while the detectives working the case stare at it and know exactly what it should mean. More than one Niagara County prosecutor looks at this file over the years and reaches the same conclusion. No, not yet. There isn't enough here, not yet, to put in front of a grand jury. Suspicion isn't proof. The law doesn't convict a man on suspicion, and it certainly doesn't convict him on hair that might be consistent with him. So the case freezes. Not because nobody knows, because nobody can prove it. The file stays open. The hair stays sealed. And Joseph Bellstat goes on living his life, gambling that time itself will simply run out on this memory. He's wrong, but he won't know that for a very long time. Joseph Bellstat lived 2 miles from Lorraine Steingasser. That's a distance you can drive in 4 minutes. A distance that meant they could have passed each other at a traffic light. That meant they could have ended up in the same grocery store aisle, standing 3 feet apart, with a lifetime of silence between them. That meant Lorraine could have seen the man who killed her daughter walking down the street, and the law said she had to let him keep walking. He went to work. He drove the same routes. He lived the ordinary life his classmate was denied, gambling that the clock would simply run out on her memory. That time and distance, and the fog of years would make this case unsolvable. He was wrong, but he wouldn't know that for a very long time. The detectives who worked this case from the beginning never quite let it go, even after everyone else had moved on. They kept the file close. They kept asking, every few years, if the technology had moved forward. Is it ready yet? Can we test it now? More than one of them became quietly, privately, permanently convinced of the same thing, long before anyone could say it in a courtroom. They knew. They just didn't have the tool yet to prove it. Years passed. The story faded off the front page of the local paper. New crimes took its place. New victims. New investigations that demanded attention and resources. But somewhere in that police department, in filing cabinets and storage boxes, Mandy's case never got filed away completely. It stayed open. The hair stayed sealed. The evidence stayed waiting. For 24 years, that's all this case was. A hair sample sitting untested, a killer who believed he'd gotten away with it, and detectives who refused to accept that answer. Then, somewhere between 2015 and 2017, the science finally caught up. The extraction methods got more sensitive. Labs learned to read genetic material that previous technology couldn't touch. The threshold dropped below what those 2 hair roots could provide, which meant, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the hair wasn't useless anymore. In 2017, detectives pulled that old evidence envelope off the shelf and made the call. The hair was sent to the lab, and this time, it could finally be read. The lab report came back in March of 2018. Both hairs belonged to Mandy Steingasser. 25 years of doubt gone in a single paragraph of lab paperwork. The science that didn't exist in 1993 had finally matured into something that could read the truth, locked inside those 2 tiny roots. In 1993, a lab technician could already see what was there under a microscope. Both hairs had their roots still attached. Both had been separated by force. That detail, visible for decades, meant struggle, no ambiguity. But the microscope couldn't speak. It could only show what violence looked like. The microscope couldn't prove whose violence it was. By 2017, far more sensitive DNA extraction methods had finally arrived. New technologies, new procedures. Labs that could pull a usable genetic profile out of material that previous equipment would have called too small, too old, too fragile. The sensitivity threshold had dropped. The possibility had finally opened. The hair, in other words, had been screaming the same truth for 24 years. The science was just finally able to listen. Within weeks of the lab report, a grand jury heard the case. The same case that 2 prior prosecutors, years earlier, had decided wasn't strong enough to even bring in front of them. This time, the district attorney walked in with a hair, a lab report, and 25 years of patience. It was enough. The grand jury handed down an indictment for second-degree murder. April 24, 2018. 25 years almost to the season after Mandy disappeared, police pulled into Joseph Bellstat's driveway. He was just getting home from work. It happened to be his 43rd birthday. The police waited. When he stepped out of his car and saw them standing there in his driveway, before anyone said a single word, his hands went straight for the door locks. A grown man locking himself inside his own car, in his own driveway, like 25 years of suspicion had just caught up to him in a single second. It didn't save him. They arrested him right there on the same street where he'd been living the entire time Mandy's mother was waiting 2 miles away. Second-degree murder. Bail was set at $250,000. He paid it. He walked back out into the same town. He went back to living on the same streets, waiting for a trial that wouldn't happen immediately. 3 more years would pass. 3 more years of living free, while the case moved through the system with the speed of institutional process. The indictment came down quickly. Second-degree murder. A charge that carried weight, that said the state believed Joseph Bellstat had intentionally killed Mandy Steingasser, that there was probable cause to believe his actions had crossed the line between accident and crime. But probable cause isn't proof. It's just enough to say a crime probably happened, and this person probably did it. It's the first threshold, the lowest one. A bail hearing happened. The judge looked at the evidence. 2 hairs that DNA had now confirmed belonged to Mandy. His lies, his failed polygraph, his story falling apart under scrutiny. The judge set bail at $250,000. Bellstat paid for it. In a town of 60,000 people, there was no way to disappear. He went back to work. He went back to his house. He went back to living on the same street he'd been living on for 25 years, now with a murder charge hanging over him. Lorraine Steingasser lived 2 miles away. The law said she had to accept his freedom while she waited for a courtroom to deliver what DNA had finally made possible. 3 years passed. 3 years of legal filings. 3 years of discovery motions where prosecutors handed over evidence and defense attorneys requested more. 3 years of expert witnesses being arranged, of forensic consultants being hired, of arguments being prepared. 3 years of a criminal justice system moving at its own pace, while a man who'd lived free for 25 years lived even freer under the assumption that trials always take time. The case was scheduled for 2020. By early 2020, it seemed like it might finally happen. Opening statements. Testimony. A jury sitting through a night that was nearly 30 years old. But the system had one more delay in store. One that no one could have predicted or prepared for. One that would add another year to the waiting. 2020 arrived, and the trial was finally scheduled. After almost 3 decades, after DNA had finally made prosecution possible, after bail had been paid, and Bellstat had lived free in a town that knew what he'd done, a courtroom date was set. Opening statements were going to happen. Testimony was going to happen. A jury was going to hear the evidence and decide. And then the world shut down. In March of 2020, courts across the country closed. Courtrooms sat empty. Judges issued orders. No trials. No in-person proceedings. No jury gatherings, where dozens of people sat in close proximity for hours while testimony unfolded. The COVID-19 pandemic had brought the criminal justice system to a halt, the same way it had brought everything else to a halt. Nobody could have predicted it. Nobody could have prepared for it. The judge had no choice. On March 16, 2020, a mistrial was declared. 27 years of waiting and justice got postponed by a virus nobody could have anticipated. The case that had finally gotten DNA results had to wait a little longer. The trial that was supposed to happen didn't. Opening statements got pushed. Witnesses were released from their subpoenas. The calendar moved forward, and the trial date moved with it, further away, into the unknown. Lorraine Steingasser waited through a pandemic. Bellstadt waited through a pandemic. Detectives who had kept this file alive for a quarter century waited through a pandemic. Nobody knew when courts would reopen. Nobody knew when trials would resume. Nobody knew how long the pause would last. It would last until October 25th, 2021. October 25th, the same date that Mandy's body had been found 28 years earlier. The same date that started the next phase of this story, as if time itself was closing a circle, giving the trial a date that meant something to the history of this case. 28 years to the day, the trial would finally begin. The courtroom was packed. 28 years to the exact day that Mandy's body was found, a trial began in a room full of people who had been waiting for this moment in different ways. A mother who had carried a single ring in her pocket for nearly 3 decades. Detectives who never let the file die. Friends who were teenagers in 1993, now middle-aged adults, sitting in a witness chair, trying to recall details from a night none of them ever expected would matter this much. For 3 weeks, 65 witnesses took the stand. Classmates testified about that night. Police described the investigation. Forensic experts walked through what DNA extraction means, what it proves, what it shows. The timeline got rebuilt piece by piece. The same night told over and over from different angles, until a complete picture emerged. 2 women sat in that witness chair separated by the years they'd aged. Both of them had been on an empty street at 1 o'clock in the morning in 1993. One had stood at a payphone. One had looked out an apartment window. Both had watched a car slow down, make a U-turn, and pull up beside a girl they didn't know. Both had seen her get in without hesitation. Both had watched the car drive away. Now, nearly 30 years later, they pointed at Joseph Bellstadt, sitting at the defense table. That's the man. That's the car. That's what we saw. And this time, there was DNA that said they were right. Lorraine Steingasser sat through every single day of testimony, holding onto a ring. Investigators had found it with her daughter's body. A ring that had once been hers. She held it through the witness testimony. She held it through the forensic presentations. She held it through the moment a man who once shared a cell block with Bellstadt took the stand. He testified that Bellstadt had described the night to him, in Bellstadt's own words, exactly how it had ended. Not a cold, calculated murder. Not a stranger attack. An accident, Bellstadt had said. An escalation in the backseat of a car that completely spiraled out of control. It was the closest thing to a confession this jury would ever hear, and it didn't come from Bellstadt's own mouth in this courtroom. It came from a man he'd once trusted enough to talk to behind bars with nothing left to lose. The defense tore into him on cross-examination. A jailhouse informant, they argued, telling a story that conveniently fits the prosecution's theory. A witness with incentive, they said. How do you know he didn't just tell you what you wanted to hear? It was a fair question. Juries don't love witnesses who once shared a cell with a man on trial. But the story stayed consistent, detail for detail, no matter how many times they made him repeat it. The defense fought back the only way they could. They pointed out that DNA found inside Mandy's clothing didn't match Bellstadt at all. It belonged to a completely different man. Someone Mandy had been involved with before she died. A man with arrests of his own. For one moment, it looked like real doubt, the kind that could unravel everything the prosecution had built. Then prosecutors reminded the jury where that man actually was, the night Mandy disappeared. 1,300 miles away, already living in another state, 2 full days before she ever got in that car. The defense called character witnesses. They said Belstadt was small, harmless, a kid who once got shoved against a wall by Mandy's own cousin and never fought back. Not exactly, they argued, the profile of a killer. The prosecution didn't need him to look dangerous. Looks weren't evidence. Hair was. Testimony was. The pattern of lies was. The behavior that followed was. The DNA was. For 3 weeks, a jury listened. They took notes. They watched 2 women point. They heard a man describe an accident that spiraled. They saw physical evidence and heard expert testimony. They watched a case that was 25 years cold come alive in real time. Then they went into a jury room to decide. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty of second-degree murder. Joseph Belstadt was convicted on October 29, 2021. 28 years later, he drove away from an empty street with a girl who recognized him. 28 years later, he walked into a police station unprompted and started lying. 28 years after 2 women watched a car make a U-turn. 28 years after a strand of hair sat in an evidence bag completely useless, waiting for science to catch up. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. 30 years to life means he will spend the rest of his life in prison, or he will spend 30 years there and then face another review. Either way, he will not walk the streets of North Tonawanda again. He will not drive past the place where Mandy's mother lives. He will not wake up on another birthday thinking the clock has run out on this case. For Lorraine Steingasser, the ring she had been holding finally stopped meaning what it meant before. It stopped being a plea. It stopped being a promise unfulfilled. It became what it was always supposed to be, a memory of her daughter. What this case teaches us is something that echoes through cold case work everywhere. DNA didn't solve the mystery of Mandy's death. Investigators solved it in 1993. 2 witnesses saw what happened. A suspect fell apart under questioning. Evidence was collected properly. The mystery was solved the moment those 2 women pointed. What DNA did was prove what investigators already knew. It transformed suspicion into proof. It made certainty into law. It closed a gap between what detectives believed and what a courtroom could convict on. For 25 years, that gap was unbridgeable. Then, technology moved forward, and suddenly it closed. That matters because it reminds us why cold case units exist. Why do detectives keep files open? Why families never stop pushing for answers? It wasn't DNA that gave this case its first breakthrough. It was persistence. It was 2 detectives asking, every few years, is the science ready yet? Mandy Steingasser was 17 years old when she got into a car she recognized on an empty street. She was 17 when someone who knew her hurt her and left her in the woods. She was 17 when her mother's promise to always bring her home broke for the only time that mattered. She stayed 17. For 28 years she was a girl with Led Zeppelin on her bedroom walls, frozen in amber, waiting for the science and the system to agree on what had already been true all along. The case is solved now. Justice arrived late, but it arrived. And somewhere in the work of science catching up to suspicion, somewhere in the space between 1993 and 2018, there's a lesson about why we keep looking, why we keep asking, why we refuse to let files die. If you've made it this far, you understand why cases like this matter. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more stories like Mandy's out there. Cases waiting for technology, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question, waiting for persistence to pay off. I'll be here to tell them. Thank you for listening.